A robbing moth. He who for evil purposes tries to get into a soul always first endeavors to silence the watchman. The conscience. Think of your conscience as a watchman to protect you from evil influences that could come in.
I never thought of it like that, but yeah, that's right.
Readers will recall to mind the way in which Diabolus in Bunyan's Holy War is stated to have gotten rid of Lord Wilby Will in his first approach to invade the town of Man's Soul. Huber records this singular conduct of bees whose hives had been plundered by the moth. The moth called at Sharonita Atroops, the well-known death's head moth. This moth is unique among Lepidoportia in its capacity of uttering a peculiar piping sound, closely resembling a sound given by the queen bee in certain circumstances, which has a most extraordinary effect on the bees in the hives. Mr. Huber thus describes it. The effects are very remarkable. As soon as the sound was heard, bees that had been working in plucking, biting, and chasing the queen about hung down their heads and remained together almost motionless. And whenever she made this sound, the bees did the same thing. One summer, the beekeepers in the district of Switzerland where Mr. Huber lived were much puzzled to account for the apparent bad success of their bees. The season had been good, the bees were healthy and active, but the hives, when lifted, were very light. The results of all their industry were most disappointing. A watch was set upon the hives, and when the cause was soon discovered, in the twilight of the evening, the moth I have mentioned, which was unusually plentiful that year, was detected in large numbers entering the hives. This they were able to do with no trouble by their producing which I have described. Apparently the same effects were produced upon the bees as they were caused by similar noise of the queen. In this way it appeared the moths had been successful in their robbing the hives. When this was discovered, the owners of the hives placed before the entrance a grating of wire with openings big enough to let the bees, but too small to allow of the entrance of the moth. The result was an immediate improvement in the yield of honey. But what seemed very unusual, those hives which were not so protected also shared in the improvement. On examination, a most interesting discovery was made. Behind the entrance of the unprotected hive, unprotected by the owner, it was found that the bees had built a double wall of a mixture of wax and propolis, the one close behind the other, each of them perforated with holes through which the bees found entrance to the hives. But those of the inner wall were not placed opposite to the holes of the outer wall, so that the bee had to turn in the narrow space between the two walls. This made it impossible for the moth to get in, even had they been able to push themselves through the hole in the outer wall. In this way the bees had successfully defended themselves, as their neighbors had been defended by their proprietors. This would seem most completely to answer your test. The power of an animal to meet an emergency of a simple kind. Surely, one would say, here is proof of reason as it is given by the ant or by the beaver in overcoming an injury to its settlement. The bees proved that they knew the cause of their unsuccessful labor. They reasoned What shall we do? What would keep out the robber? But their knowledge and their reason were not strong enough to overcome the singular insect which caused them to lie still and motionless under the influence of the plunderer's music, instead of stinging her to death in a moment, as they would have done any other intruder. It's amazing how our Creator gave those bees the knowledge to be able to build 2 walls with holes in them, but there would be a wall here and a wall here, 2 walls, and then there'd be a hole here in this wall and then a hole over here. So the bee has to go in, turn a corner, and then go in the hole. And the moth couldn't go through that type of a turn. And so the bees were successful in keeping out this moth. Sin is like a moth. This moth was keeping the honey from being produced. It was a drain on the whole colony. So sin is like this moth that's draining your whole system of spiritual, moral strength. So our conscience is like this door, that this obstacle course that the moth could not go through. Our conscience is like that. So perhaps your conscience has become weakened or destroyed or thrown down, broken apart. Let's pray together that our conscience would be built back up, restored, so that we would be strong. We'd have a barrier to keep out temptation.
And spend time with the Lord
Yes,
to rebuild it.
that's right. Absolutely.